The sun above Rios 3 was not a true sun, but a cold dwarf star that burned white against a bleached sky. Its light felt harsh and somehow metallic, as if it scraped across the skin instead of warming it. Aaron Blake stepped off the transport ramp and felt the dust crunch beneath her boots. The ground stretched into endless ridges of cracked earth, each one curling upward like scales on the back of an enormous dead creature. The air tasted dry enough to crumble inside her mouth, as if every breath stole a little more moisture from her lungs. The instructors, a group of broad-shouldered reptilian officers, stood in a line facing the cadets. Their scales gleamed like polished obsidian, and their expressions carried no sympathy whatsoever. Aaron knew from experience that trials on Rios 3 were designed to fail entire squads. The planet had swallowed cadets in the past, not through predators or storms, but through simple dehydration. Alien species evolved on moist worlds struggled to last even a single day here. Aaron understood that every decision today mattered. One instructor stepped forward. He held a transparent crate filled with metal objects, water filters, purification straws, mineral stabilizers. The cadets instantly recognized the gear and straightened with a mix of hope and relief. But that hope disappeared when the instructor slammed the lid shut and announced that none of the items would be used today. Another officer walked along the line of cadets and collected every filtration tool from their belts. Aaron watched as confused alien cadets protested, one after another begging for at least a basic purifier. The officers ignored every complaint. Aaron handed over her filter without argument. She understood the instructors far better than most cadets. Every trial had logic, even when it felt cruel. If the instructors removed equipment, it meant the terrain itself held the key. She scanned the dusty valley again, trying to memorize anything unusual. Shallow depressions, faint mineral colors, the way distant ridges curved. Something here must be useful. The alien cadets, however, reacted with rising panic. Rios 3 was not known for mercy. The pools scattered across its surface contained water, but that water was thick with metallic dust and parasitic organisms. The locals, an insectoid species, boiled everything they drank. Most off-worlders, including several members of Aaron's squad, would become violently ill if they tried to consume it untreated. Aaron could already hear worried muttering spreading through the group. One cadet with pale violet skin whispered that she could not survive more than a few hours without hydration. Another asked if the instructors intended to watch them die. The lead instructor raised his engraved baton. Silence fell instantly. He announced the rules. Each squad must locate a natural water source, make it safe to drink, and survive until the next sunrise. No technology, no imported chemicals, no prefabricated materials. Only what the terrain offered. He gestured toward the jagged valley, and the sharp peaks cast long shadows across the cracked earth. Aaron noticed that the instructor's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than on the others. She wondered if they expected something from her specifically, or if they merely waited for the human to break first. Humans had a reputation among the instructors, unpredictable improvisers who succeeded in ways that made no sense to other species. The moment the trial officially began, the cadets scattered. One group sprinted toward the nearest ridge, hoping to find a hidden reservoir behind it. Another began digging shallow trenches in the ground, trying to tap into underground pockets of moisture. Aaron did not follow any of them. Running blindly wasted energy and water, and digging without understanding the soil was pointless. Instead, she walked alone toward a slope where the ground coloration shifted slightly from pale beige to a deeper ochre red. She knelt, lifted a handful of the powdery material, and rolled it between her fingers. It clumped more easily than sand. It held traces of moisture. It smelled faintly metallic, a sign of mineral-rich clay beneath the surface layer. She brushed aside the top dust and found a compressed patch of clay that resisted her touch. It was not fully dry, but not wet either. She pressed harder and felt the clay give slightly, almost like stiff dough. She dug deeper with her fingers, shaping out a chunk the size of her palm. When she squeezed it, it held its form. That meant it could be molded, and if it could be molded, it could be shaped into something useful. Erin's mind began assembling possibilities faster than she could process them. Clay could be transformed by heat. When clay hardened, it became ceramic. When ceramic was heated again, it became porous. The right structure could act as a primitive filter, not perfect, but safe enough to drink through. Behind her, frustrated alien voices rose. Some cadets shouted that the instructors wanted them to fail. Another argued that the trial violated safety protocols. One cadet collapsed to sit on the dry earth, insisting that without proper filtration gear, no one could produce drinkable water. Erin ignored all of it. She pressed another clump of clay between her hands, testing consistency, imagining the exact thickness she would need for the walls of a filter chamber. One cadet, a thin amphibian with translucent skin, approached her hesitantly. He asked what she was doing and why she was wasting time with dirt. Erin answered calmly that she was looking for materials. He did not understand. His species relied on biological filtration membranes, not geological methods. Erin explained clay's properties in simple terms, but he seemed overwhelmed and eventually returned to his squad. Erin stood and surveyed the valley again. She identified a dead tree stump half buried in dust. Its roots had twisted into the ground, leaving small cavities beneath the surface. Those cavities might hold clay with slightly higher moisture content, perfect for molding. She crouched, reached into one of the hollow spaces, and felt cool earth under her fingertips. She worked in silence, extracting larger pieces of clay, setting them in a pile beside her. She felt the eyes of several cadets on her, confused and skeptical. The sun continued its slow climb. Heat shimmered across the ground in trembling waves. Erin wiped sweat from her forehead, conscious of how much hydration she was losing by simply existing here. She had to work methodically, without rushing. Panic was the true killer on Rios 3. When the instructors walked past, one of them paused beside her and studied the clay pieces arranged at her feet. Erin did not look up, but she sensed his curiosity. He asked her if she intended to build something. She replied that she would know once she tested the material. He gave a slow nod, neither approving nor discouraging her, then moved on to monitor the other cadets. Erin continued kneading the clay, feeling its temperature, assessing how fast it dried in open air. Every detail mattered. She needed to know how quickly she could shape and harden it before it became too brittle. She considered the sun, the nearby rocks, the fire she would eventually need to build. She ran through the steps in her mind: gather fuel, shape the clay, build a basic kiln, control the heating, and repeat the firing process until the clay became porous enough to filter water. It was a complicated plan, but it was the only plan that made sense. When she finally stood up again, she looked over the silent valley and felt a brief spark of confidence. The others were lost in fear because the instructors had taken their tools. But Erin understood that survival came from adaptation, not equipment. The ground beneath her feet already held the solution. All she had to do was turn raw earth into something that could save lives. She lifted the largest piece of clay, weighed it in her hand, and felt the rough potential in its shape. The trial had barely begun, but Erin could already see the path forward. And unlike the other cadets, she did not fear the landscape. She respected it. Rios 3 was harsh, indifferent, and deadly, but it was also full of resources for those who knew how to look. The instructors wanted a trial of endurance. Erin intended to give them a demonstration of ingenuity instead. Erin pressed the clay between her palms once more before setting the lump down beside the growing stack. The material was promising, but she needed far more of it if she intended to build anything substantial. The dryness of Rios 3 made every movement feel heavier than it should have been, and the atmosphere carried a faint metallic tang that clung to her throat. She inhaled slowly, reminding herself to conserve every bit of moisture in her body. She had a plan forming in her mind, but to make it real, she needed a clearer understanding of everything around her: the soil, the heat, the minerals, the plants, and the wind patterns. The environment itself would determine whether her idea succeeded or crumbled. She walked toward a small rise in the terrain, her boots scraping against the cracked earth with a sound like breaking glass. The ridge cast a thin shadow across the valley floor, and she stepped into the shade for just a moment to let her eyes adjust. The ground here differed from where she had collected the clay. It was darker, denser, and lined with tiny veins of rust-orange mineral deposits that shimmered faintly under the star's harsh light. She crouched and tapped the ground with her knuckles. The surface vibrated with a surprising firmness, almost like cooled volcanic sediment. If the area had once experienced geothermal activity, the minerals left behind could affect how clay behaved when heated. Aaron picked up a small stone. The surface held an almost glassy texture, curved in a way that suggested it had once been exposed to high temperatures. She slipped it into her pocket. She would examine it later. A faint tremor rippled through the ground beneath her, not dangerous but persistent enough to catch her attention. She steadied herself and listened carefully. Rios 3 was known for deep tectonic pulses, slow and rhythmic, caused by the moon's internal pressure shifts. Those pulses occasionally loosened clay deposits deeper underground. If she could find a section of Earth where the tremors had recently widened cracks, she might uncover larger, purer layers of material. She closed her eyes and let the vibration guide her. The sensation wasn't strong, but it moved through her bones like a distant heartbeat, gradually shifting direction. She set off toward the area where the pulse felt most pronounced. The cadets behind her continued wandering across the valley, searching desperately for anything that resembled clean water. Their voices carried through the dry air, full of exhaustion and frustration. Aaron tried to tune them out, focusing only on the environment. Rios 3 did not reward panic. It rewarded observation. She followed a sloping path that led between two large boulders and discovered a dried stream bed that wound like a twisted scar across the ground. She knelt beside it and examined the sediment. The stream had once carried brackish water, but the sun had baked it to a white crust. Aaron scraped a sample with her fingernail. The residue flaked off easily, revealing a thin layer of compacted clay beneath it. She smiled faintly. This was what she needed. Clay that had been shaped by water flow and pressure. Clay like this usually held a uniform texture, perfect for shaping. She began digging with her fingers, forming a shallow pit. The deeper she reached, the cooler the earth became. After several minutes, she uncovered a large patch of smooth clay that glistened faintly in the filtered sunlight. It felt heavier, denser, and far more workable than the scraps she had found earlier. She worked silently, lifting chunks from the ground and stacking them neatly beside her. The tremor under her feet continued, steady and predictable, loosening more clay as she dug. The sensation reassured her. This part of the valley offered exactly what she needed. As she filled her pack with clay, she noticed a cluster of brittle plants growing near the old stream bed. The plants had thin, hollow stalks and leaves shaped like narrow blades. Aaron snapped a stalk gently, and it broke with a clean crack. The interior was dry but sturdy, forming a natural tube. These plants could serve as support structures or reinforcement strands when weaving other materials together. She gathered several stalks and bundled them under her arm. Every resource mattered, even if she wasn't yet sure how she would use each one. The wind shifted suddenly, sending a wave of fine dust sweeping across the valley floor. Aaron covered her mouth with her sleeve and turned her head away from the gust. The dust settled quickly, but the wind direction told her something important. The valley funneled air between the ridges in a predictable pattern. If she built a fire in the wrong location, the wind would smother it. She needed a natural windbreak, something that shielded flame but allowed enough ventilation for heat to build properly. She scanned the surrounding terrain and spotted a cluster of stone outcroppings farther along the ridge. The stones were arranged in a semicircle, likely formed by old erosion patterns, or perhaps by ancient water flow that carved the valley long before cadets ever trained here. The space between the stones looked ideal for constructing a small kiln or fire pit. She memorized the location before returning to her clay pile. With her pack nearly full, she sat on the ground and exhaled slowly. Sweat trickled down her forehead, leaving cooling streaks along her skin. She wiped it away carefully, refusing to waste even a drop. Her throat felt dry, but she ignored the discomfort. Hydration would come later, only after she figured out how to purify water safely. She rolled her shoulders back and looked across the valley, watching the other cadets struggling in the distance. Some knelt beside stagnant pools, staring helplessly at the murky liquid. Others paced in circles, unable to decide whether to join another group or continue searching on their own. Aaron understood why the instructors had chosen this trial. It revealed character. When tools were stripped away, what remained was the truth. Either a cadet adapted or a cadet failed. Aaron rose and walked toward the stone outcroppings she had noticed earlier. The ground softened slightly as she approached, suggesting that the area might once have held more moisture than the surrounding terrain. She stepped between the stones and tested the wind flow with her hand. The rocks shielded the air perfectly. She crouched and placed a few pieces of clay on the ground, arranging them in a line to test their shape and weight. The clay held together nicely, neither too crumbly nor too wet. She pressed her thumb into one of the pieces, creating a shallow depression. The clay responded smoothly, retaining the imprint without cracking. That confirmed it. The material was workable. She stood again and scanned the ground for fuel. The valley lacked large trees, but that didn't mean it lacked combustible material. Off in the distance, she saw dried shrubs with thick, dull brown branches. She approached one and snapped off a branch. The wood cracked with a satisfying sound. It would burn quickly, but if she gathered enough, she could sustain a fire long enough to heat the clay. She gathered several branches, testing each one to find the sturdiest pieces. A few had hard, resinous cores that felt slightly sticky to the touch. Resin burned hotter and longer. She pocketed those carefully. By the time she returned to her chosen site between the stone outcroppings, the sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the ground. The air cooled slightly, but the heat still radiated off the rocks beneath her feet. Erin set her materials down and closed her eyes briefly. She replayed everything she had learned about Rios 3 during her training, its mineral composition, its heat cycles, its biological hazards. The moon was hostile, but not impossible. If she worked quickly and intelligently, she could create a functional purifier before nightfall. She opened her eyes and knelt beside her supplies. She picked up a piece of clay and smoothed it between her palms, feeling the weight of the responsibility on her shoulders. This wasn't just about passing a trial. Her squad was counting on her, whether they realized it yet or not. If she succeeded, she would provide a solution that none of the instructors had expected. If she failed, dehydration would claim more than one cadet before sunrise. Erin took one long breath and began shaping the clay, letting the rhythm of the work quiet her mind. The environment around her had revealed its secrets. Now it was her turn to shape those secrets into something that could save lives. Erin pressed the newly gathered clay into a compact mound beside her chosen workspace, feeling the sun's heavy heat settling deeper into her skin. The stone outcroppings shielded part of the wind, but the dry air still pulled moisture from her with every breath. She could not afford to hesitate. The clay she had collected would begin drying soon, and once it passed a certain point, shaping it would become far more difficult. She knelt, rolled her sleeves up, and placed her hands on the earth to steady herself. Her fingertips brushed the ground, measuring temperature and texture. The surface still radiated stored heat from the harsh white star overhead, which meant it would serve as a natural pre-warming platform for her clay structures. She needed to use every environmental advantage she could find. She selected the largest lump of clay, roughly the size of her forearm, and sliced it into even portions with the edge of a flat stone. The clay offered strong resistance, too dense to split cleanly without pressure. Erin leaned into the motion, pushing her weight into each cut until the portions separated. She rolled one piece between her palms, shaping it into a thick cylinder, then pressed her thumb into the center to create a hollow channel. She rotated the clay slowly, widening the channel with a meticulous patience that came from years of wilderness experience. The wall thickness needed to be uniform. Any weak points would crack under the intense heat she planned to generate. Once the cylinder held a smooth shape, she set it carefully in a patch of shade beside a smaller mound of clay. She repeated the process, forming 3 more cylinders of varying sizes. Each one required time and concentration, and she refused to rush the process. Precision mattered far more than speed at this stage. When the last cylinder was finished, she began shaping 2 flat discs of clay, pressing them into circles and smoothing their surfaces with steady strokes. These would serve as structural layers later, helping redirect water flow through the purifier. She pressed her fingertip into the first disc and nodded to herself as the indentation held firm. The clay mixture was perfect. Now, she needed fire. Erin rose from her kneeling position and walked toward the pile of dry shrubs she had collected earlier. The brittle branches snapped as she approached, releasing faint puffs of dust into the air. She gathered the thickest pieces first, then created a separate pile of slender twigs and dried plant fibers. She knelt between the stone walls and arranged the smaller material into a compact nest. She placed a few resin-rich branches beneath the twigs. Those branches would burn longer and hotter, essential for turning raw clay into something close to ceramic. The next challenge was ignition. She searched the ground for a stone with a rough, sharp edge and found one near the base of the outcropping. She held it against the glassy stone she had pocketed earlier and struck them together. The impact produced a small scatter of sparks, but none of them reached the nest of twigs. She tried again, adjusting her angle and force. A spark finally landed in the dried fibers, glowing faintly, but fading too quickly. Erin shifted her position and struck again, harder this time. A crackling spark fell directly into the center of the nest. She leaned forward immediately, cupping her hands around the forming ember to shield it from the wind. She exhaled in slow, steady breaths, feeding warmth into the tiny glow. The ember brightened, spreading along the fibers like a fragile thread of fire. With a soft whoosh, the nest ignited. Flames licked upward and began devouring the twigs. Erin built the fire patiently, adding branches only when the previous layer had caught completely. The heat intensified quickly, radiating in shimmering waves. Even with the protection of the stone outcroppings, the wind occasionally shifted, causing the flames to dance unpredictably. Erin adjusted the placement of the branches to maintain a consistent burn, ensuring the fire would produce the stable heat she needed. When the flames settled into a strong, steady roar, she lifted the first clay cylinder and placed it near the fire, not directly in it. Clay needed to dry gradually before being exposed to extreme heat. If she placed it too close too soon, moisture trapped inside could expand and shatter the cylinder. She rotated the piece every few minutes, allowing each side to warm evenly. As she worked, thin lines of sweat traced down the side of her neck, absorbing dust and turning into faint streaks of reddish mud. Eventually, the cylinder became firm enough to handle direct heat. Erin positioned it beside a cluster of rocks she had arranged earlier in a semicircle. She nudged the cylinder into the center of the structure and fed the fire carefully so that flames brushed the clay evenly. As the heat intensified, the color of the clay shifted subtly from pale ochre to a deeper, warmer shade. She watched it closely, monitoring for any signs of cracking. After she felt confident with the first piece, she placed the second cylinder in the same position, lining both shapes side by side to share the growing heat. As the clay hardened, the air grew thick with the scent of resin and scorched minerals. The fire hissed occasionally when the resin-rich branches burned, sending small sparks upward. Erin demonstrated complete focus, rotating each cylinder periodically and adjusting the fire's intensity with careful precision. Her muscle memory guided her movements, each action deliberate and efficient. After several cycles of heating and cooling, the cylinders began to transform. Their surfaces smoothed and hardened, their color deepening further until each piece resembled a primitive ceramic tube. Erin tapped one gently with the side of her knuckle. It produced a satisfying hollow sound, a sign that the clay had hardened correctly. She removed the first cylinder from the kiln-like structure and set it on the ground to cool. The second cylinder followed shortly after. She repeated the entire process with the remaining pieces, working silently and efficiently until a full set of hardened components lay cooling beside her. Once the pieces cooled enough to touch, Erin examined each one carefully. She ran her fingers along the edges, checking for hidden fractures or weak points. The smallest cylinder needed reinforcement, so she placed it aside for later repair. The others, however, were nearly perfect. She then picked up the flat clay discs, pressed them lightly against the fire-warmed stones, and shaped their edges into gentle curves, forming plates that would help regulate pressure and distribute liquid flow. Her next task was creating the internal layers of the purifier. She sifted through the ground near her workspace and found small pockets of fine gravel scattered throughout the valley floor. The gravel was multicolored, gray, beige, and streaked with orange minerals. She collected enough to fill the base of the purifier. Then she searched for sand. Unlike the abundant clay, sand on Rios 3 gathered only in natural wind traps. She walked along the ridge until she found a shallow pocket where the wind had deposited a mound of pale sand. She scooped it into her hands and let it run through her fingers. The grains were fine and dry. Perfect. Erin carried the sand back to her workspace and spread it in a thin layer over a flat rock. She heated it gently with fire until it reached a warmer consistency. Warm sand filtered more efficiently and helped stabilize the internal structure. As she worked, the harsh light of the dwarf star began to soften, shifting into a muted glow that signaled the approach of evening. The temperature dropped slightly, though the Earth still radiated the accumulated heat of the day. She arranged the ceramic cylinders in a vertical stack, placing gravel at the bottom and warm sand in the middle. She connected the pieces using woven plant fibers she had collected earlier. The hollow plant stalks acted as structural supports, keeping each segment aligned. The entire structure stood nearly the height of her arm when fully assembled. The purifier looked primitive, yet every part of it represented a deliberate, thoughtful choice. Erin brushed her hair back from her face and surveyed her creation. It stood sturdy despite its simple materials: clay, gravel, sand, and plant fibers. The fire beside her continued burning, its flames casting shifting shadows over the purifier's surface. She exhaled slowly. Her hands were coated in dust and clay residue, her arms stiff from the repetitive motions. But the hardest part of the construction was finished. Now she needed to test it. Night approached, and with it came colder air and the quiet tension of the valley. Erin placed the purifier beside her and began gathering the final materials she would need for the test. She knew the next moments would determine whether her plan succeeded or collapsed. She knew her squad's survival depended on what happened next. Tomorrow's sunrise meant victory, but to reach it, she needed her purifier to work, and she would not allow herself to fail. Erin positioned the clay purifier beside her small fire, letting the residual warmth seep through each layer of the structure. The approaching dusk cast long shadows across the valley, stretching over the cracked ground like dark, reaching fingers. The air cooled quickly now, losing the oppressive heat of midday and replacing it with a sharper, thinner chill that settled heavily in her lungs. She took a slow breath, feeling the dryness scrape the back of her throat. The need for water pressed on her mind with increasing urgency, but she forced herself to stay focused. Impatience could sabotage everything she had built. She carried the purifier to a shallow decline in the valley floor, where a stagnant pool lay beneath a cluster of boulders. The water shimmered faintly as the dying light reflected off its murky surface. Dust and metallic particles drifted in slow patterns across the top. Erin crouched beside the pool and studied the water carefully. She dipped 2 fingers in and felt a thick, almost oily texture. It was worse than she expected, denser with mineral contaminants and carrying a faint smell like rusted metal. Her stomach tightened at the thought of drinking even a drop of it untreated. She reached down and filled a small bowl-shaped rock with the brackish water, lifting it slowly so she would not disturb too much sediment. As she returned to her work site, the alien cadets noticed her movement and began drifting closer, though none approached her directly. Erin ignored the growing presence behind her and set the stone bowl beside the purifier. She knelt and touched the ceramic surface one last time to ensure it had cooled adequately. The faint warmth in the clay reassured her. Warm ceramic filtered differently, more efficiently, than cold material. She placed the bowl above the purifier, angling it so the water would pour steadily through the top cylinder. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the bowl again, not from fear, but from the simple strain of dehydration. She steadied her grip, set her jaw, and began pouring. The murky water slid through the top opening, coating the inner walls of the first clay segment. It dripped slowly into the gravel layer below, and she leaned closer, focusing on the faint sound of liquid trickling through the purifier. Seconds passed. Nothing emerged. She exhaled and placed the bowl aside. The purifier needed time. The clay had to absorb excess moisture and begin the natural filtration cycle. She pressed her fingers to the outer surface and felt the vibration of water moving, slow but steady. The gravel clinked faintly as the trickle passed through it. Erin remained completely still, listening as each layer accepted the liquid and forced it downward, squeezing impurities through the narrow ceramic pores. 1 minute passed, then 2. A bead of clear liquid formed at the bottom edge of the purifier. It gathered slowly, suspended like a perfect drop of glass, catching the last streak of light from the setting star. Erin held her breath, watching its surface tension build until it finally released. The drop fell onto the smooth rock beneath the purifier, forming a small, glistening circle. Erin stared at it for a long moment, barely daring to believe what she saw. The water was clear, truly clear. Not gray, not brown, not streaked with minerals. She leaned closer, inspecting the drop. It showed no cloudiness, no sediment, no metallic sheen. Her heart pounded with cautious optimism. She gathered more brackish water from the bowl and poured again, this time with steadier hands. The purifier accepted the liquid with quiet determination. More droplets began forming beneath it, falling one by one in a slow, rhythmic pattern. Erin placed a small, concave stone beneath the purifier to collect the drops. As the stone filled, she knelt closer and watched the runoff pool at the bottom. Still clear. Her throat tightened with the instinctive need to drink, but she hesitated. She studied the droplets more closely, examining their clarity in the fading light. The purifier had performed exactly as she hoped, but she wanted certainty. She delicately dipped a fingertip into the small pool and lifted it to her lips. The water tasted plain, like nothing at all. No bitterness, no grit, no metallic aftertaste. She exhaled through her nose in silent relief. It worked. Behind her, an alien cadet gasped. Erin turned her head slightly and saw a young insectoid female standing at the edge of the outcropping, her antennae twitching with confusion. The cadet's large eyes fixated on the droplets beneath the purifier. Erin met her gaze briefly, but offered no explanation. The cadet took a hesitant step closer, but before she could approach fully, Erin returned her attention to the purifier and added more water from the bowl. She focused entirely on the growing pool of filtered liquid. The purifier released droplets more steadily now. Warmed by the day's heat and structured perfectly, it had begun to operate at full efficiency. Erin filled the stone bowl twice more, pouring carefully each time. When the collection stone beneath the purifier held enough water to cup in her hands, she lifted it and drank. The water slid down her throat, cool and pure, easing the dryness instantly. A wave of energy washed through her, the first real relief she had felt since morning. The insectoid cadet watched in visible shock, her mandibles trembling slightly. Aaron extended the collection stone toward her in a silent gesture. The cadet stared for several seconds, torn between fear and desperation. Finally, she stepped forward and accepted the stone. She raised it to her mouth and consumed the purified water in slow, uncertain sips. Her posture straightened visibly as the water eased her dehydration. Aaron met her eyes again, and the cadet dipped her head in a small, grateful nod before stepping back. Another cadet approached cautiously, a tall reptilian male with scales that reflected the soft twilight glow. Aaron did not speak. She simply began pouring more water into the purifier. Soon, droplets resumed falling steadily into the collection stone. The reptilian cadet waited silently until the stone filled. He drank quickly, unable to hide the relief on his face. Word spread. More cadets appeared, drifting toward her in quiet groups. None spoke. Their desperation carried through the way they moved, slow but hopeful, drawn by the sight of clear water gathering beneath a structure built from nothing but earth and fire. Aaron continued working without pause, pouring, collecting, handing off water to whichever cadet stood closest. The purifier performed far better than she expected. The clay's porosity matched the minerals of Rios 3 perfectly, as if the moon itself had offered her the exact materials she needed. As the last light faded completely and nightfall settled in, the air grew colder, but the purifier continued dripping. The fire beside her crackled softly, casting orange light on the stone outcroppings. The cadets stood around her like silent silhouettes, watching her hands move, trusting her work, even though none of them understood how she had created it. When the flow finally slowed to a stop, Aaron allowed herself to sit back on her heels. Her arms trembled from exhaustion. Her throat no longer felt like it was closing, but her body reminded her of how much she had pushed herself. She stared at the purifier, admiring its sturdy form. It looked unremarkable, just clay, sand, and gravel, but its presence changed everything. It represented survival. It represented knowledge. It represented the difference between desperation and hope. She placed her hand on the clay surface, feeling the residual warmth of the fire within the hardened layers. The purifier stood solid and unwavering under her touch. More water would come, more relief, and more strength for what awaited them at dawn. The cadets remained beside her in the dim firelight, no longer panicked, no longer wandering aimlessly. They watched Aaron with a quiet reverence, as if the act of purification had transformed her into something more than a fellow cadet. But Aaron did not seek admiration. She simply closed her eyes for a moment and allowed herself a single thought. They would survive now. And tomorrow, when the instructors returned, they would see what determination looked like on Rios 3. The night settled over Rios 3 with a sharp, brittle stillness that pressed into Aaron's ears like a physical weight. The dwarf star had sunk behind the jagged ridges, leaving only the fire's flicker and the faint luminescent sheen of mineral dust scattered across the ground. Most cadets remained close to the purifier, sitting in quiet clusters. They drank, recovered, and watched the slow drip of clean water with an expression somewhere between disbelief and reverence. Aaron sat apart from them, her back resting against one of the stone outcroppings. Her body ached from the day's strain, but the exhaustion felt steady and clean, earned, not overwhelming. She tightened her hands around her knees and let her breath fall into a calmer rhythm. The purifier continued working even as the temperature dropped. The clay walls held warmth longer than Aaron expected, and the layers inside remained functional long into the night. She added more resin-rich branches to the fire, ensuring the purifier stayed warm enough to maintain its flow. The flames pulsed brighter with each log, casting a warm glow across the faces of the cadets nearby. Every time the purifier released another drop, the sound felt louder than it should have, as if the entire valley had tuned itself to listen. Hours passed quietly. The cadets rested, whispering only in soft murmurs, careful not to disturb the fragile peace that had settled over the group. Erin found her eyes drifting toward the horizon, wondering how many hours remained until the instructors returned. She was not anxious about their arrival. She had no reason to be. But she felt an odd curiosity building within her. She wanted to see their reactions. She wanted to watch the exact moment when the officers realized that the trial had unfolded in a direction none of them predicted. Eventually, exhaustion forced her to rest. She lay on her side near the fire, letting the heat brush her face. She closed her eyes, remaining half alert, ready to wake at any sound. The cadets kept watch without needing to be asked. The purified water had given them enough strength to stay awake through the night, and each one seemed determined to guard the fragile structure that had saved them. Erin drifted in and out of shallow sleep, listening to the fire crackle, the purifier drip, and the distant rumble of Rios 3 shifting beneath its dry surface. When the first pale beam of dawn touched the valley floor, Erin opened her eyes. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, but the purifier still stood firm, coated with faint dew from the cold night. Several cadets had fallen asleep upright, their chins resting on their chests, but one or two remained awake, their eyes fixed on the horizon. Erin pushed herself upright, stretching her sore shoulders, and shook the stiffness from her hands. She rose slowly and approached the purifier. The last of the clean water had collected in the bowl beneath it. She knelt and inspected it. The liquid looked just as clear as the first batch from yesterday. She poured it into a larger stone container and set it aside for the cadets who had not yet had their morning drink. A low hum vibrated through the air, the unmistakable sound of a transport approaching. Erin looked up and saw the instructor's vehicle descending from the ridge above the valley. Dust rose beneath it in swirling columns. The instructors exited the craft with rigid posture, expecting to find a squad weakened by dehydration, possibly even unconscious. Erin could see it in the way they scanned the terrain, searching first for collapsed bodies or signs of distress. Instead, they found cadets rising to their feet, steady and calm. A few rubbed sleep from their eyes, but none looked weak. None looked defeated. The instructors exchanged brief glances, visibly confused. The lead officer's gaze shifted toward Erin, narrowing as he searched for the missing piece of the puzzle. She met his stare without flinching. The officer walked forward slowly, his heavy steps cracking the dry ground. When he reached the purifier, he stopped. His eyes followed the structure from bottom to top, lingering on each clay cylinder, each woven fiber, each hardened plate. He touched the surface lightly with one scaled finger, pressing just enough to test its durability. The clay held firm beneath his touch. Erin stepped closer and explained nothing. She waited. The officer inspected the purifier for several moments, then lifted the stone bowl filled with the morning's clean water. He held it up to the light. The water caught the dawn's first rays and refracted them in a pure, colorless glow. The officer hesitated, studying the clarity. Then he drank. Silence fell over the entire squad. The officer lowered the bowl and looked at Erin again, this time not with confusion, but with something heavier, something closer to recognition. One of the reptilian cadets stepped forward and said, in a strained, careful voice, that Erin had made the purifier from clay, gravel, and sand found in the valley. Another cadet added that she had made fire with stones and resin-rich branches. A third explained that she had built the purifier before dusk, and that every cadet who drank from it had regained enough strength to survive the night without symptoms of dehydration. The instructor raised a hand, signaling for silence. He continued examining Erin, his expression unreadable. She stood tall, refusing to avert her gaze. Her clothes were covered in clay dust, her hair tangled, her arms streaked with faint scratches from digging and gathering materials. She did not look polished or pristine. She looked like someone who belonged in survival trials, someone who understood how to treat a hostile world as an ally instead of an enemy. The lead officer finally spoke. His voice carried none of the harshness he had used during the briefing. He announced that the squad had not only completed the trial, but had surpassed its intended objectives. He declared that while the trial was meant to evaluate individual endurance, the cadets had demonstrated collective survival through skill, resourcefulness, and leadership. He emphasized the last word while looking directly at Aaron. The other instructors stepped forward, inspecting the Purifier with the same mix of curiosity and respect. One of them asked Aaron how she knew clay could be transformed into a filtration system. She explained calmly, detailing the firing process, the layered structure, and the way heat altered clay's porosity. She spoke plainly, offering knowledge rather than pride. The officers listened attentively. One by one, the cadets approached the Purifier again, forming a loose semicircle around it. Their expressions revealed something more than gratitude, something closer to realization. Aaron had not just given them water. She had given them a blueprint for survival, a reminder that environments could be deciphered, understood, and used even when stripped of all tools. When the officers called for the squad to prepare for departure, the cadets gathered their belongings, but several lingered near the Purifier. Aaron stepped beside it and placed one hand flat against its surface. She knew the clay would eventually crack or erode under the harsh conditions of Rios 3. It was not meant to last forever. It had served its purpose. Before leaving, the lead officer addressed the squad one last time. He said that in every cycle of training, instructors attempted to find the boundary of what cadets could achieve without tools. He said that this time, the boundary had moved. He glanced briefly at Aaron again, and she felt a subtle shift in the air. Not admiration, not awe. Something quieter, more grounded. Respect. As the squad boarded the transport, Aaron turned for a final look at the Purifier standing between the stone outcroppings. The dawn light painted the clay in warm shades, giving it a gentle glow that contrasted sharply with the harshness of the previous day. She breathed in slowly, let the air fill her lungs, and felt her exhaustion melt into a steady, solid sense of accomplishment. She had taken earth, fire, and desperation, and turned them into life. As the transport lifted off and the valley shrank beneath her, Aaron closed her eyes and allowed one clear thought to settle fully in her mind. A world does not need to be kind for a human to survive it. It only needs to be understood. And she had understood Rios 3 well enough to save them all.